Adams is a great fly to teach hackle tip wing technique as well as a dry fly tail. As you can see on the Adams here, we're going to use some rooster hackle fibers for the tail, and we'll use some rooster hen neck feathers to do our wings. We'll do a tapered dubbed body, which we've already learned in a previous fly, and then we'll also learn how to wrap two hackles. We've got one brown and one grizzly on this fly. So we'll go ahead and put a hook in the vise. And again, we're working with just a standard dry fly hook. And we'll go ahead, the Adams traditionally calls for a black thread. We're working with our same 70 denier ultra thread. And proportions on this, unlike the caddis where we did a complete dubbed body on the entire hook shank, we're going to work with more of a 60%, 40% proportion. So our body, tapered body, will take about 60% of the hook shank, and then the front 40% we'll leave open to do our hackle and our wings. So I'll get my thread started, and we'll wind back here to the starting point. And for my tail on this fly, again, we're going to work with some brown colored rooster hackle fibers. Whiting Farms offers a package of materials called a tailing pack, which is these rooster feathers that have real long, stiff barbs, so they make wonderful dry fly tails. Again, you don't have to select this off of a neck or off of a saddle. You can get it in a pre-packaged form like this, which takes a lot of the guesswork out. You already know that you're using the correct material for what you're going to be tying. So we'll select a feather, and all of the fuzz and the web at the base can be removed. We're most interested in these nice long, stiff fibers up here on the tip of the feather. So we can pull those down, either strip them or just trim this off. And just like we did on the tail for the hare's ear, but we're just working with a slightly different material, we'll take and stroke some of those fibers so that they're 90 degrees to the stem of the hook. We'll follow our same proportion guideline where we want, when the fibers are pinched together in our fingertips, we have about 2 times the diameter of the hook wire. So we'll come in here, and again we want to get a hold of the tips of the fibers, and we'll just peel those off and transfer those into our bobbin hand. So we can see that we've got the tips evened up for our tail. Now we can bring these to the hook and measure these for length. And dry fly tails, just as we did with wings, a good starting point or a good reference point that you can work with. And it will vary. I mean, as you tie more flies and you start to do different things, you're going to find that your needs or the proportions will change depending upon what you're imitating. But for right now, we want to make sure that these tails are the length of the hook shank. So from the starting point to directly behind the eye of the hook. So I can hold it up, get my measurement, transfer it into my opposite hand, and lay it in right on top of the hook shank. And we can either use a pinch loop, or another technique that you can use is, and we looked at it with doing the wing case on the hare's ears, but we can let the thread actually roll the material into place. So by holding the fibers at an angle on the near side or on your side of the hook, and I'm just going to spin my bobbin here to help tighten that thread because it's untwisted. Hold it at an angle on your side of the hook and come in with just kind of a soft loop of thread, and as you come over the top, tighten, and you can see it rotate or twist those fibers and lock them into position on top of the hook shank. Before we let go, we'll take some additional wraps and wrap up towards the eye of the hook, and then we can check to make sure that our length and our proportion on our tail looks good. If it's too long or too short, just back up and redo it. I mean, that's one of the great things about fly tying, is if you do make a mistake, it's very easy to go back and fix. You just unwind and redo it. Now the butt ends on this, I'm just going to pull up and we'll trim those off. I'll leave just a little bit of them there so that we're kind of creating a level underbody to put our dubbing over. And then I'm going to move my thread back down the hook so that I'm right at the starting point. For my dubbing material, we'll work with some superfine dubbing, just in an Adams gray color. And this is a synthetic dubbing as well. There's a lot of great natural dubbings. Traditionally this is done with muskrat fur, but I like some of the, especially for dry flies, some of the synthetics, the superfines, and the more micro type fibered materials. Take and twist this on good and tight. Again, we want to create a tapered body, so you can either do that by creating the taper on your thread, or as we discussed earlier, to get a good solid body and foundation, if we just keep our dubbing even on the thread, we can create the taper as we wrap it forward by just overlapping our wraps and generating that taper. And for the most part, an Adams is a very generic mayfly imitation, and mayflies are typically fairly, again, have a very smooth, gradual taper. This is not an abrupt taper. So we want to concentrate on keeping that body as smooth as possible as we come forward. One thing sometimes that will happen with dubbing as you're wrapping, you can see that this is loosened up a little bit on my thread. Rather than just wrapping that on and creating some fuzziness, I'm going to back off and just come in and retighten that just a little bit. And then go ahead and finish my taper to my body. And again, we want to go to about that 60%, 40% point. We want to make sure we leave enough space in the front part of the hook to do our wings and our hackle. At this point, I'm going to advance my thread to the middle of that 40% area in the front part of the hook shank. And for our wings, we're going to use some grizzly hen neck feathers. And this is from a whiting winger cape. This is a grizzly hen neck. You can see that these feathers, the tips of the feathers are much more rounded than what we have with the rooster feathers that we've used for hackle. So they make ideal wings for little mayflies. And I've already got 2 feathers that I've plucked here, and I'll show you how I size these before we tie them on. Generally, a good rule of thumb to follow is you can, by laying the tip of the feather, you want it to be roughly the same shape as the bend of the hook. Again, it won't always be exact, but it gives you a good guideline so that you're somewhat in proportion. And again, as you go larger or smaller in hook size, it'll help keep your wings proportionate. So once I've got 2 matched feathers, I'm going to lay the curves of the feathers so that they're opposing one another. And we'll help use that curvatures, the 2 curvatures of the feathers to help divide and split these on the finished fly. So once I get them, the tips evened up with the curvatures separated, or again opposing one another, then we can bring it up to the hook shank and measure for length. Just like on the elk hair caddis, we're going to measure our wings to the length of the hook shank. So I'm going to lay it on top of the hook shank with the tips of the feathers at my starting point and come in and grab that with my opposite hand. Now, if I were to cut these directly behind the eye of the hook, they would be exactly a shank length, but we need a little bit of additional stem in order to attach these to the hook. So I'm going to come even with the front of the eye and trim those feathers. So they're an eye's length longer than what they really need to be on the finished pattern. Just lift those up, and if you just tap the tips of those or that cut end with your fingertip, you'll be able to see the 2 separated stems. And we're going to, as we tie these in, we're going to lay the stems on each side of the hook. We're just going to split the hook wire with the 2 feathers, and once I've got them separated over the hook, I'm going to turn those towards me, and we're going to use the same technique that we used when we set the tail and let the thread lock these into position. So I'm going to come over with just a loose wrap of thread, just catching those stems, and as I tighten, it will twist those and place them on each side of the hook rather than the top and the bottom. I'm going to take 3 or 4 tight wraps, and then I'm going to wrap forward towards the eye of the hook. Remember, if you wrap back over them, you're going to end up tying them in. I'm going to lift them up here. You'll end up wrapping back over the wing and tying in all the way back to your dubbing, and you won't have any room to put your hackle in. And additionally, as you wrap over the feather, when we stand these up, they're going to be too short because you've tied too much of the feather to the hook. Now we're ready to stand these up. So we're going to come in, we'll pull the tips forward out over the eye of the hook. We'll take our bobbin in our opposite hand, and we're going to take about 4 or 5 wraps of thread right behind the wings, but right up tight to the stems on the feather, so that they're vertical on the hook. Take and separate those with our fingertips. And now we're going to figure 8 the wings to help keep them divided and separated while we're fishing the fly. So starting with our thread behind the wings, I'll bring the thread perpendicular to the hook shank, and I'll cross through the center of the wings, make a turn of thread underneath the hook shank in front of the wings. Then we'll take our thread, so we're perpendicular again to the top of the hook shank. We'll cross back through to the rear of the wings and take a turn of thread around the underside of the hook and staying behind the wings. We'll repeat that process a couple more times just to build up a dam or a little wedge of thread between the wings to help keep them divided. And we want to end up with our thread back behind the wings, and we're going to take that right back to in front of our body. Okay, now we'll reposition our wings. They may look fragile, but you can move these and manipulate them around quite a bit, get them positioned to where you want them on the hook. And our final step, or our final material that we're going to tie on the hook, is going to be the hackle. And for this, we'll use, again, some of the Whiting Hunter Pack rooster saddle feathers. Again, these are pre-sized for the hook size that we're working on, so it eliminates the guesswork and the sizing of the hackle. You know that your proportion is correct for your hackle feather. The Adams calls for 1 brown and 1 grizzly, and I've got one of each feather already selected. We'll do the same thing that we did for the elk hair caddis. We'll trim this off just to get an even point on the feather, and we'll make a small trim on each side of the stem just to leave some little fibers, or again kind of that comb shape on the end of the feather. I'll do the other feather as well. We want to do these separately, and then we will tie them on the hook as one, but we'll wrap them separately. So I'll just make a small trim on each side of the stem, and then we'll take the 2 trimmed ends and align those. And again, we want the shiny sides of the feather, when we tie these in, facing us. So we'll make sure that the 2 trimmed ends are evened up. We'll come in right in front of our body. Again, a little bit of an angle on the near side or our side of the hook. We'll take a loose wrap of thread, tighten that, and then we'll continue to wind forward and take our thread up to the index point. And you can move a little bit closer, a little bit further beyond. What we've been using is that half of eye's length. You can eliminate some of the bulk just by how much thread wraps you take to finish this off. So we'll take, and again we want to wrap this 1 feather at a time. So I'll start with the first feather, and unlike the palmered hackling, we want to make sure that these wraps of hackle are right in front of the previous wrap, and we want to fill those voids between the body and the wings. When I get up to the rear of the wing, I'll pull the wings back, and I'll take a wrap of hackle right in front of the wings, and then continue forward up to where my thread is hanging near the eye of the hook. I'll hold that in my opposite hand. We'll take 3 wraps of thread, and I'm just relying on the weight of the bobbin to hold this in position. We'll just leave that feather there for now. We'll come back and grab our second feather, and this is no different than wrapping the wire through a palmered body. As we wrap the second feather through, we want to zigzag and work that down into the stem of the first feather so that we don't crush the hackle that we've already put on the fly. Pull the wings back, get a wrap right up in front of them, and you can, the stems of those hackle feathers are actually helping hold your wings upright. It just gives them a little more durability because the wings are sandwiched between the stems of the hackle feather. Bring that up to where our thread is hanging. We'll take a couple wraps of thread over that, and then we'll come in and do some cleanup work with our scissors. We want to get in and trim these down as close as possible to the eye of the hook and eliminate any of the fibers that are out over the eye. And again, this is where a pair of good scissors with sharp tips really pay off in doing a little cleanup work. Before we do the whip finish, I'm going to come in and make sure that I'm happy with the way that the head is looking here, and we'll actually let the whip finisher build the head on the fly. So I'm going to remove all those little loose fibers or stray fibers, and then we'll go ahead and hook up our whip finisher. And again, by relying on the whip finisher to help build the head, we can reduce the amount of thread wraps that we need to tie all that material off. It's even more so important when you're tying little flies. You start tying little 20 and size 22 dry flies, and you want to make sure that you're not plugging the eye up with material. So on smaller flies like that, or even the smaller Adams, just maybe take 1 or 2 wraps of thread and rely on the weight of the bobbin to keep some tension on that feather, and then allow the whip finisher to actually build the head. But here's a finished Adams. We'll go ahead and apply a little bit of head cement to this. And again, this is a good fly to imitate a variety of different mayflies. Again, the techniques for the hackle tip wing and the standard dry fly tail allow you to do a variety of different mayfly patterns just by changing the color and the types of materials that you're working with.